All right, awesome. I just want to thank everyone just a final time here for joining in. I appreciate that you guys are taking the time out of your week to learn a little bit more about Knowify and today specifically labor costing. Today's webinar is number 3 out of our 5-part series on becoming a certified Knowify advisor. And this is going to be covering not just simple labor costing, but kind of various different aspects of labor costing that go into Knowify, around budgeting and scheduling and some other small parts of the system there. Again, we do record all of these. This is all going to be on YouTube, so you can watch these at a later date when you are taking your certification quiz later on. Our next week's part, for what it's worth, will be covering our contract management and revenue tracking Knowify. And the final webinar, number 5, will be all about QuickBooks integration and getting really in deep with how QuickBooks works with Knowify, how Knowify works with QuickBooks, and different options that we provide. But I'm going to start by just getting into a little bit more information on what we're going to be covering with this webinar. The first thing we're going to cover is how to set up all of your users in Knowify and how to set up the labor rate for each of these users. Kind of a side note, we did a webinar previously where Tanya Schulte went into a lot of detail on the importance of labor burden and kind of how to calculate good rates. I highly recommend checking that out if you'd like to learn more about this beyond Knowify, but also just more information on setting up these rates for your clients in construction. Next, we'll be getting into the budgeting side of labor, how to set up your hourly costs, when you're estimating the cost of the job, and then, how to track all of your actual costs logged by your employees versus what you set up as your budget when setting up the project. Obviously, through this, we'll be discussing tracking time. That's where the labor costing really happens in Knowify. Is as the hours are logged in the system, we take that times the hourly rate, and that's where we're showing your labor cost in real time. I am going to touch on scheduling a little bit. I won't be getting into too deep of detail on it because it's not a necessary part of labor costing, but it is a really helpful thing that a lot of people would like to learn a little bit more about to help their clients when they're getting to the point of starting them up on the smartphone app. And again, kind of through that, I'll be showing the smartphone app briefly here. We do have really detailed videos on using the smartphone app, which you can check out as well. And the last thing we'll go through is a little bit of an overview on how the QuickBooks integration is going to work when it comes to time tracking in Knowify and pushing to your QBO account. But the first thing I want to discuss in Knowify is the different types of users that we have. The 3 basic types of user we offer are full access to Knowify, mobile access only, and non-access. Basically, a full access user is plain and simple a user in your Knowify account. They get access to the web interface, so what you're logging into with the browser. And so if they need to have access to things like creating bids or proposals and communicating with the client, invoicing, sending out purchase orders to the vendor, setting up budgets and managing different phases of the project, kind of through that also scheduling, then they're going to need to be a full access user. This is available, if they use a tablet. A lot of people ask about, getting this type of functionality in the field. You don't need to use the smartphone app as a field user. If you have a tablet with internet access, you can log in with full access and get way more functionality than we provide with our smartphone app alone. The other type of user is going to be a mobile access only user. I'd also like to mention that the full access users automatically get mobile access, so you don't need to set them up as both if they're going to be in both web and the smartphone app. You just need to set them up as full access. That's actually why we specify mobile access only. These users can really only use our smartphone app, which is really made mostly for time tracking. But since we have a lot more than just time tracking in Knowify, there's a lot more functionality in the mobile app. So they have the ability to upload things that they've purchased. They go to the vendor and they take a picture of the receipt, say this is how much I've purchased, this is what the vendor was, they'll be billing us later, or maybe they can say, I bought this with my own money, I'm requesting reimbursement. That's all managed through the smartphone app as well. Just so they get a little more functionality and can communicate with the office from the field better. The mobile app also has some functionality around comments, uploading images, and I can get into a little bit more of that later on. And then we also have the ability to log what we call non-access users. Non-access users are really meant for employees who get their time logged for them. We set this up so if you have a foreman who runs your crews, and this one foreman enters the time for everyone else as they arrive to the site, we don't want you to have to pay full price for a full mobile access user. So you can set up a non-access user in the account, which just means someone else is going to be in charge of entering the time into Knowify for them. Hence, they have no access, but they are technically an employee in the system. This is also really useful if you're using a different time tracking app with Knowify. We do have an integration with T-Sheets, so we can import time from ClockShark. And so in order to actually get those hours into Knowify, you need to have the time submitted against an employee. So you set them up as non-access users, since technically they're logging into T-Sheets or ClockShark and not Knowify. And when you're setting up a user, this is what the screen is going to look like as you enter the information. A lot of the information that, all of these fields, with the exception of your cell phone number, is mandatory in order to get this set up. You'll see that it asks for type of access first. Again, through the demo, we'll get into a little bit more detail on this. And we separate first name and last name. The email is going to be important because this is what they use when they're logging into Knowify. So it'll ask them for their username and password. The username is just the email. We actually use this also to send them an invitation when you add a new user to your account. This way, they just get the prompt, you've been invited to such and such company, click here to get started, and it lets them set up their password and everything. Next, it asks for a role, and I'll get one of my next slides is going to be a little bit more heavily focused on what a role is in Knowify. But the short version is that this is a type of worker that you have in your system. So like I have here, Paul McCartney is a foreman in my account, which means when he tracks hours, it's going to show on the job as foreman hours spent. Approval authority is for when you have varying levels of how much an employee can purchase without having someone approve it first. I'd say the most common levels of approval authority are 0 or unlimited. But basically the idea is that an employee with 0 approval authority can enter in an expense and it'll go to whoever their direct manager is. You'll see that we have that field in here as well. And the direct manager will have to approve before we add the purchase as a job cost and before we have any kind of integration with your QuickBooks account. Then down below, you see that we have a set of permissions. We have a blog post that recently went out about how all these permissions affect what the users can and can't see. The simple explanation of this is that it's turning on and off different modules. If they are not responsible for paying bills, then we turn off the bills module, so they don't even need to see that. And so it's just kind of a way to make sure you get a custom layout for each employee, so they don't see more information than they're supposed to see. And then you'll see this more actions option at the bottom of the menu. This is basically just a way for you to disable and enable users. So if you have someone who's a temporary worker, you disable them, they're removed from billing for a little bit, you enable them, you get them back into the system. And then it's also a way that you can manually reset a password for employees. So if they forget their password, you don't need to know their old one, you just come here, manually set it. It's a much smoother, easier process in our experience. One field that isn't shown here is going to be when you're actually synced with QuickBooks. This screenshot I show you here is one that's not connected to QuickBooks, but there will be an additional field that shows a list of all of your employees in QuickBooks. So that way, as you track time with this Knowify user, we know which QuickBooks employee to push the time to. Once you have your users set up, it'll ask you to set up your labor costing rates. And I should actually mention that the rates are set in a different tab of the admin section, so it's important to know to move from your users to rates as soon as you set each of them up, just so that way you make sure that everyone has a rate as soon as they start time tracking. It makes everything much more, it makes a much smoother process once they're getting started, so they don't track some time at $0 an hour and you have to go make adjustments later on. So it should just be a general habit. Once I'm done setting up my users, I go to rates and I enter in all of their pay information, labor cost information, I should say. And this table is basically a way to calculate how much we add to the job cost for every hour that they log into the app or into the interface. And you see we build a little table here so you can calculate outer rate. The most important one here being the final column, this hourly rate. Everything else is really just a calculator. It doesn't make much of a difference, inside the rest of Knowify. It's just kind of to help out contractors. In our experience, a lot of contractors that are working with accountants just have a lump sum rate that they know to plug in here. Since they'll be getting a little bit more technical than the simple fields we have here, but it's really however you prefer to manage it. Again, the most important rate is this final one. That's what we're applying to your job costing. You'll also see that we have the option to switch between hourly and yearly. If you set them to yearly, we just divide whatever their yearly salary is by 2,000 as the approximate number of work hours they should be spending in a year. And that's how we calculate an hourly rate for you. That way, even though their hours may not be directly going to a project, or they may not be getting directly paid for their individual hours, you can still see how much it's costing your job for their time, which is obviously a very important part of what we're offering here at Knowify. I'd also like to mention that none of these rates are actually pushing to QuickBooks. This is just in Knowify internally for the sake of labor costing and knowing where you stand on a project. QBO doesn't really have a way to enter in labor costs at this point in time as an hourly rate, and so it's all just in our system, so you know where you stand on a project, and then the hours are what's going to end up pushing to your QuickBooks account. Also, at the bottom of your rates module, the same screen I was showing you earlier, you'll see an area called roles and applicable rates. Basically, this is where you set up the different roles in your system. For what it's worth, when you're adding a new user, if you put in a role that hasn't been used before, it will automatically generate one for you, so you don't have to come here and add a role every time you have a new type of work in the system. But I'd like to specify the difference between billing rate and budget rate, because this is something we get asked about a lot. And in a way, neither of them actually affect job costing directly. Your billing rate is going to be the default rate that is applied as revenue when you're invoicing your clients. How much you actually request from the client for the hours spent by your company specifically within these roles. So like I charge my client, in this example, $100 an hour for foreman hours, and if my laborers are working, $80 an hour. These can always be adjusted when setting up time and materials contracts, or if you're doing service work and there is no contract, it can be adjusted when invoicing. But it's nice to have a default, so if it's 9 out of 10 times the same number, you don't have to adjust it every time. Then when it gets to budget rate is going to be for when you're using Knowify to estimate the cost of a job. Basically, this way, if I'm trying to say, okay, well, I know that it's going to take me 10 foreman hours to complete this job, we use this budget rate times 10, and we say it'll cost you $450 in labor. So that's really the relevance of this number. So it doesn't actually affect when you're actually logging foreman hours. But that way, when we're tracking our actual versus estimated, this is the estimated. This is the budget that we're tracking the hourly rate against. A lot of this information, again, can be adjusted when setting up a project plan. So if you want to make some tweaks here and there while you go through, that's always an option. And if you don't set up a budget rate, I'd like to mention that we'll take the average of every user you have under this role. I'm actually going to go back a slide really quick. You can see that the role is noted next to each user. So we'll take all of the hourly rates, take the average, and that's what we're going to assume the budget rate is because none was set. So the next thing I'm going to get into really quickly here is setting up labor budgets. Now, I do like to mention that budgeting is never a mandatory part of Knowify, but obviously it's always recommended. A big, powerful part of what we do is give you the information of this is how you performed versus how you expected to perform, and that's where this is going to come into play. And you'll notice that a lot of these are very similar to what we covered in materials last week, where one thing we recommend is professional style job costing. This is the idea of estimating or budgeting before quoting a price. That way you can plug in those hours and say, I think it's going to take me 10 hours, and it says then it should probably cost you $450. So that when you quote your price to the client, you know to mark that up and get a little bit more comfortable with price. Plan and track, again, very similar to what we covered in materials, but this is just our cost tracking center of any job in Knowify. It's also our project plan, so it's where we'll be setting up dates for the labor. But basically, this is where we set up our budgets and then later on track our actual costs. And then when we set up our job phases, this is, again, just for more detailed levels of job costing. So if I want to know not just how much did I spend on this job, but how much did I spend on the framing of this job, that's where the job phases come into play. And this is also going to have a role when we're syncing with QuickBooks to make sure that the correct service items push across to your timesheet in QuickBooks. Now this is where it starts to get different from our material costing. You'll see that there's a button called Enable Labor, and I'm going to again be showing you this in our actual interface. But the Enable Labor button is to tell Knowify we will be tracking labor to this phase of the job. It also makes this phase visible on the smartphone app when tracking time. And the reason this is relevant is because a lot of our companies that we work with, they want to have the granular detail of phase level material costing, but they just want to see general labor costs of the job. This way it makes it easier for the users in the field, so that way they don't have to see your granular level of material costing just so they can check into the job. It just kind of simplifies the whole flow for these end users there. And then when you see the add role/resource, that's basically similar to what we had earlier with add materials, where instead of writing in the dollar figure for our budget, you'll be able to actually break it down into, not $4,000, but this many hours of this type of worker at this many dollars an hour, and it gives you more detail so you can track, how many hours did we spend versus how many do we budget, as opposed to how much money do we spend versus budget. And the last field here, very straightforward. Labor budget is just, this is how much I think it's going to cost in labor to complete this project, and or this phase of the job, I should say. And this will automatically be calculated through the flow of using the add role/resource, or you can just write in a lump sum if you prefer. So what I'm going to get into next is, the labor tracking flow in Knowify. It all starts, if you'd like, with setting up that budget. And I, do like to mention this is optional. A lot of people prefer to just set up the project plan, start tracking time, and they don't worry about budgets. Obviously not recommended, but you do have that option. Same thing goes for scheduling. You don't need to schedule in Knowify, and the way it'll work is that you set first the dates of the job, and then you schedule which users are off on that job on those days. If they don't, if they don't want to schedule with our system, maybe they're using Google Calendar or something along those lines, that's fine. They can always just pull up the smartphone app, type in the name of the job, and they'll automatically, pull up all the different open projects so they can say which one they're tracking time to. But that's where we get into the actual job costing here. And so the next part of this flow is going to be actually logging the time into Knowify. As you go through this process, each employee checks in when they get to the job site and they check out. Each checkout automatically adjusts the cost of the job. So this is where it really starts happening. This is where we're getting the job costing in Knowify for the labor. The idea is that if we are updating this with each submitted time entry, you're getting the reporting in real time every day, as opposed to trying to run a report at the end of the month using payroll or anything along those lines. And so again, this is from people checking in, checking out on the smartphone app, but then the next part of this is going to be when time is approved. So people submit the time, so it goes in for approval, and whoever's in charge of time could say, like, yes, this looks good, no, we don't approve of this. And they can also make adjustments. We see that it's very common for someone to forget to check out at the end of the day and accidentally submit a 24-hour entry. So what we do is we make sure that whoever's approving the time also has the ability to adjust it before approving, because once it's approved, that's when we're going to push it to your QuickBooks account. So that way, we don't accidentally have, these absurdly large time entries sitting in QuickBooks and going to payroll by accident. And so this all really happens in the time tracker module of Knowify. And you'll see that it's broken down into different tabs at the top of the screen. The overview tab is just going to be a very raw view of how many hours has each employee submitted each day this week. It's just a very high level idea of has everyone gotten to their 8 hours a day. Enter time is our very simple timesheet entry for each employee. You have the ability to enter it for employees if you're a foreman. But this way, someone can just pull up their, log into Knowify, pull up what job they worked on, enter their hours, and have it automatically costed and submitted for review. With kind of a similar result, our foreman view is again just another way to enter time into Knowify. The difference is when you use the enter time screen, you choose each employee, And then once you have the employee timesheet up, you choose the job, you enter the time for each day of the job. In the foreman view, you pull up a job and a specific day and phase, and then it pulls up a list of employees, so that way you can just plug in the time. It's a little bit easier for foremen, so if they're at the job site, they just say, I'm at this job working on this phase, and it'll even pull up a list of who's scheduled to work with them if they're using our scheduling, so they don't have to search through a whole list of everything. We do have a check-in and check-out view where you can see, who's checked in currently, what time they checked in, how close to the job site they were. And then you can also, manage check-in and checkouts, you can also manage checkouts, so you can see, were they at the job site again when they checked out, what time did they check out, what was the total number of hours. You also can see, have people attempted to edit their time, and you also have the ability to manually enter a check-in and check-out, which we find is very useful for situations where if an employee forgot to check in, they can either check in late and adjust later on, or if they call in the office, they can say, hey, can someone just check me in for 8 o'clock? I forgot to do it this morning. And then that way you can start the timer for them. It's a little bit more functional for some companies. The review time, again, is where we're going to be approving entries, editing them, sending them to QuickBooks. It also gives you the ability to reject or delete entries when necessary. And we also run a variety of time reports. I can show you 1 or 2 samples of it through this demo, but that's just going to be where we can get all the information in Excel or PDF format of how many hours were submitted by each employee and what were they working on. I'm just going to go through some views of different screens that I'd mentioned previously. We'll get into more detail on this when we do the demo part of this presentation, but this is what the enter time screen looks like. You'll see that I choose an employee first, and it pulls up first anything that I'm scheduled on. So there's no actual time submitted on this service ticket, but since I'm scheduled on it, it automatically shows up this week. If it's something that I haven't been scheduled on, I can click Add New Activity. And when I hit Submit, that's when it goes in for review. And I mentioned that this is kind of a similar end result of as the foreman view. This is where instead of writing, pulling up an employee and choosing the job, I'll choose the job and enter the time per employee. It's just a little bit easier of a view for someone who's on the job site and just wants to plug in other people's hours. And then, again, this shows the view when no one's scheduled, but if people were scheduled, it would pull those time entries up, or those employees up first. And then this is what the review time page looks like. Basically, you get to see everything that's been submitted. You can approve the entries by hitting the checkbox on the left, hitting approve. These little check mark boxes are, these little check boxes on the right are to edit time entries. You can see comments that were submitted. So this gets you a little bit more functionality around, here's the time that was submitted. Let's manipulate it before any kind of approval. Again, I'm going to do just kind of a quick overview of scheduling. I won't get into too much detail on this, but this is what our job board looks like. Basically, the first thing you do is you set the dates to each phase. So I can see, like, here's project 1438. The site prep started on the 16th and it'll go to the 21st. I can see that the framing starts on the 18th and that goes to the 25th. And I can schedule what we call full time, which basically means every day of the job. It's just your way of saying you're on this phase of the job until it's complete, regardless of what the dates are. But you also have the ability to schedule individual days. So you're not saying you're doing framing until framing's done. You can say, can you help with framing on Thursday? And you get more functionality that way. And I'll go through this a little bit more during the demo, but the idea is that if you schedule someone, then they don't have to search for these individual jobs and phases on their smartphone. It just shows up right on the app for them, so they just hit check in and it starts the costing. Again, we'll go into this in more detail in a bit, but just an overview of the smartphone app. The users will have the ability to check in and check out of the job site. That will be GPS tracked, so we will get their location on check-in and on checkout. And this also just will have some other general features around project management. So marking phases, or if necessary, tasks as complete, entering things that they've purchased. They can take pictures through the app and upload them right to the job as site images. And they can submit comments just to give more information on this is what's been happening on the job site today. A lot of people do ask this. The app will work if you're offline. So if you don't have cell reception, that's fine. They'll actually still let you check into the job, assuming you have the job loaded up from before you're offline. And then once you get back to service, it'll push anything that you did while you were in offline mode into the office, so that way you can get all of your job costing updated. And we do have as part of our dashboard the ability to see, who's been checked in so far today. Has there been breaks in the middle of the day? This is actually taken from one of our existing customers. You can see where the lunch breaks come into play. If it's gray, it means they're still checked in, and this is just a way to see, is everyone actually working? And if you ever see this loudspeaker, it means send a push notification to my employees. And we have this screen in our scheduling tool called Last Check-ins, where I don't just see distance from the job site, but actual location logged from their smartphone. So that way, it's one thing if they checked in at a Home Depot, it's something else if they were at a McDonald's around the corner when they checked in. And when it comes to QuickBooks integration, well, I mentioned that you map employees to users. Basically, the Knowify users aren't always going to be directly integrated with your QuickBooks employees. You have to go to each user and say, this Knowify user is this QuickBooks employee. That way, when we push the time, we know which one to associate, which employee to associate all the time with. That way, we find that a lot of people, obviously on payroll, you have the full name, whereas in Knowify, just for the sake of making it easier for the staff, they use nicknames. It's just so we understand, whose time goes to which user. We'll have something called the default service for time entries, and I'll show you more about how to set this. Basically, it's saying if you haven't specified what service these people are working on, what do you want us to use? It's just to make sure that we always have some way to push to QuickBooks. And then the last thing is what we call phase level service tracking, which is the idea of switching up which service item we use based off of what phase of the job that they have checked into. So now I'm going to show you a little bit more about what this looks like in Knowify. Let me just pull up my account here. So I'm going to start in my admin section by adding a new user. For what it's worth, as part of your advisor account, you'll automatically get this admin access, so you'll have the ability to add users and map to QuickBooks and get all of that functionality. But I'll go ahead and add a new user here. I'll give them regular access to Knowify. And so as I fill in this information, it's just collecting data on how it's going to be tracked in Knowify. So, the email, again, is to help this person log in. The role is going to be so, we know where to associate their time when they're tracking it in the project plan. We'll make this guy a foreman. And this guy is going to have unlimited approval authority, and I can turn on all of the permissions. I don't have any employees in the QuickBooks account that's linked here, which is why I pulled up a blank field. But just to show you what it would look like if we were going to use a different type of access, if I call them mobile access only, you see they only get two options. They can either track their time or they can track theirs and everyone else's time, which is being a foreman. A lot of people think that naming the role foreman is what turns this on. That is incorrect. It's turning on this permission. That just gives them the ability, if they are a mobile user, it gives them the ability to check in other users, and if they are a web user, it gives them the ability to approve time cards. Again, if you do write in a new role that hasn't been used here, you saw that it actually recommended a couple, but if I wrote in something new, it would create a new role using that phrasing for what it's worth. You don't have to always manually add them every time. But I'll go ahead and just set up this user. Actually, I want to mention, if you have 1099 workers that are going to be set up in Knowify as vendors, and that's actually what I'm going to be showing you when I track time and push to QuickBooks, you can call it a subcontractor with mobile access to Knowify, and it'll ask you which vendor in your database to match with. That way we know where to push the time in QuickBooks. This is just a mobile access to Knowify only type of user, but you do have that functionality again. It's still the same, and they have all the same use. It's really just about QuickBooks integration there. And then a user with no access, it still prompts for a lot of the same information, but we don't ask for anything around email or anything like that, since they're not actually going to be logging in anyway, so someone else will manage it. But I'll set up this user with regular access to Knowify. And what this does is it sends that user an email, so they can be prompted, okay, now please use this information to log into Knowify, and it'll ask them to reset their password. But if you'd like to make it a little bit easier, you could say, Sam, reset password, Sam123. And this way, he doesn't have to, go through the email. So if you have fake emails, which a lot of the times is the case with our mobile users, you can say, this isn't a real email. It's just, what you use to log in. Here's your password. That's how you can get access to Knowify. And as I mentioned, I'm going to go right to rates now. So before I do anything else, I'm going to come into this screen where I can see all the different rates per employee. And I have the option of saying, this is going to be a worker that's making, $50 an hour, or I could say yearly, 100,000 a year, and that'll calculate my $50 an hour. It's really just for the sake of getting this final number. But you can see that as I enter this information in, he makes 43 with $2 an hour in benefits. Here's the labor tax. Here's insurance, workman's comp, union wages. Other is really just kind of a general column. So if you want to just factor in something that maybe may not be calculated throughout the rest of the system, you can say plus this $2 X factor per hour. And now this will save in the system. So when he tracks time, it's going to use this 58.54 rate. This is also, I mentioned the roles and applicable rates. This is where we have the ability to say, we charge $100 an hour for advisors, $150 for our equipment, $80 for our foremen, and $50 for laborers. And then when I'm estimating the cost of a job, I assume it's going to be around $70 for an advisor, $100 for equipment. And it's just a way for us to get a better idea of generally how much is this job going to cost us while we put the budget together. You do have the ability to add new roles here as well. This is just going to be, if I don't have an employee to add, but I do want to have the role in the system for the sake of budgeting and billing, I have that option. So now I've set up my users for the sake of time tracking. And what I want to do next is set up my budget. So I'm going to open up my contract jobs. I actually started building one here that just so I could have it ready. I call this the lingering home remodel, and click here to build the project plan. So to set up a labor budget, I'm going to start by adding a job phase. For what it's worth, this job was done in professional style. I had mentioned that's important. That's why we can edit, plan, and track before there's an active proposal. I'm just going to call this phase site prep. And I want you to take note that I'm not actually choosing the site prep item from my database. I'm just generally calling it site prep. And I'm going to enable labor and say, my labor budget is $3,000. That's the very simple way of setting up a labor budget in Knowify. But now I'm going to get into a little bit more detail on this. We're going to say this is framing, and I'm going to choose framing. I'm going to enable labor again, and I can click this add role/resource, choose foreman, and I'm going to need a foreman for 40 hours, add role/resource. I'm going to need a laborer, laborers for 80 hours. And you see this is where the budget rate is coming into play here. I'll go ahead and save the changes to this project plan, and I won't worry about anything contract related. Again, we will be covering that all next week. I'm just going to go ahead and make this active. Now you can see once it was made active, I have my cost to date field here, so I can start tracking my actual cost versus what I set up as the budget. And we also set up a set dates button on each phase. So I can say, the site prep started actually yesterday, and it'll take us, actually I'll say, we'll be done with it tomorrow. And I could say our framing, that'll actually start today, and it should take us about 7 days. I can specify calendar days or business days, and that adds to the calendar as well. Again, the scheduling isn't necessary, but I'll show you now how we can get the time into the system. For what it's worth, we have a shortcut here where I can say site prep, labor, enter time. But I'm going to come to my time tracker now. Without actually setting up users in the schedule, I'm just setting up general time. This is the overview where I can see these are the hours everyone has submitted so far this week. But this is that enter time view I'd mentioned earlier. So I'm going to pull up my new user, Sam, here. I'm going to add a new activity, and this is for the lingering home remodel. And when he was doing site prep, he spent 8 hours today doing this. Submit. But then to show you the foreman view, I have the ability to say I was on the lingering home remodel doing site prep, and it says how many hours do you want to log for Tuesday. I can go back one day and say I want to enter Paul's hours for site prep here and Ray's hours for site prep here, and that affects the job cost as well. And so all this is just kind of automatically updating as we go through all of this information, and it automatically goes into this review time, so I can see, here are the entries, and I can approve them. But I want to show you a little bit more about how the how the scheduling is going to work here. So I'll come into my scheduling view, and we start with corporate calendar. Now I'd mentioned that there's two parts of scheduling. First scheduling the dates of the job, then scheduling the employees. The corporate calendar is the best place to schedule the dates of the job. So this is where I can see, site prep is going to go till tomorrow, and I can adjust that and say, actually, we'll finish it up today. But now to schedule who I need to work on framing, I'm going to click job board. This is where we can actually see, for the week, what different jobs and phases are we working on. I'm going to get a bit of a cheerier color here. I'm always a big fan of like a Knowify orange, if I can get to it. Well, it's not quite there, but same general idea. And so to schedule someone, I'm going to grab my users here and add them to the board. But first I want to pull up my mobile app on the screen so you guys get to see what this is going to look like. So this is Knowify's mobile app, and right now I have no one scheduled. I have this user as Paul Simon, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to grab him from the job board with Paul, and we'll grab our new guy, Sam, and we'll grab Ray. And to add them to the schedule, if I, today is Tuesday, so I'll say add them to framing schedule. And this will automatically pop up as something they're scheduled to work on. So you see, I didn't really have to click anything. This kind of just showed up. I'm going to click on this job to get more information. I didn't even have to open that up, though. I could just click check in, and it starts tracking the time. But I'll click this now for more information. You can see at the top of the screen here, there's a running clock to show me how long I've been checked in so far. I have the ability to check out and make an adjustment to the time. I've actually been here for 8 hours. I checked in late. I can enter comments if necessary. And that adds it to the cost of the job as well. And I can see my time card of different entries that I've submitted so far this week. And I also have the ability to just manually enter an entry. We've been here for 8 hours, select job. I'm going to actually put it on a different phase of the same job. And so if I search here, it pulls up the different open phases. This way I know what I'm supposed to be working on. I get a little more functionality, and then I can actually also submit this for tomorrow for whatever reason. So that's just how I can get time entered from the smartphone app into the into the web. This is kind of the simple interface that we're working with. I won't get into much else around the mobile app, but again, I have the ability to do other things like enter purchases and parts, view different open jobs. If I'm a foreman, I have that option. And it's all just run through what you set up in the schedule here to make it easier for each user. And then since I went through a check-in and check-out, I'll just show you what this is going to look like. I can see in this view, on Tuesday, Paul checked in at 2:38. I adjusted my time up 8 hours, which is why it shows me 10:38 here. And I checked in and out at the job site. If I tried to check in off-site, it would actually show me, and I do actually get to see that this time has been manually adjusted. And also, since we set up the schedule, if I come back to this view of to this foreman view, I can actually see not just the time entries, but who's scheduled to work with them. Sorry, not just the employees, but who's actually supposed to be scheduled in on this. Now I'm going to approve these hours again. And this is going to be where we push the hours to QuickBooks. And I wanted to show you what it's going to look like when they've been reviewed. I'll click Show Reviewed, and I can see that the sync is set to OK here. So I'm going to now open up this QuickBooks page, which is where we can see different transactions that have been pushed. And here's Paul, Ray. These are my two guys synced with QuickBooks, and the time that's been created in Knowify and pushed to QuickBooks. So I'm going to log into my QBO account here now. And actually, while that loads up, I'm going to pull up my job defaults. Now, QuickBooks timesheets do have a service item that will be associated with each time entry. And so we have two levels of this, where you can have a default service for time entries, which basically means push all time to hours, as the service item. Use hours as our service item on all timesheets. But in the interest in getting more detail than that, that's why we gave you the option when setting up this job to choose specific time service items on each phase. So any hours that have been submitted against site prep, since we didn't choose one, it's going to use that hours. But anything submitted against framing, since it did, is going to use framing. So I'm going to pull up my weekly timesheet. I can see that for Paul, I'm going to pull up the Lingren House. Here was site prep hours. And of course, I messed this one up still, but the idea is that for my site prep hours, it maps to hours, whereas for my framing hours, it actually will push to framing. Sometimes I accidentally remove the item when I'm going through this. Let me pull up Ray, maybe his came through correctly. But you can see where it happened on these other ones for previous entries. This framing went to framing, painting went to painting. Here we go. So Ray, he submitted his hours against framing, so it came in as framing as a service item, and that way you can track, down to the individual entries for each one. We also have the ability to track class and location. I'll be covering that in a little bit more depth, when I go through my QuickBooks integration webinar. Again, that's part 5 of our series here. But this is how, when you're running your reports on time in QuickBooks, we make sure that the correct service item is associated with each entry. That is just about everything I like to cover around labor costing as far as getting input into the system. But just to show you the Knowify reporting, this is where I can see the total cost to date of the job versus the budget that we'd set up. I can see that it's all been labor so far, and each phase is going to show us its individual labor budget. And this is where we're really getting the powerful tools in for our contractors, is that it's not just $1,100 versus $5,200 for labor, but I'm also seeing it's taken us 24 out of our 40 budgeted hours. So if I'm done with this project, and that's awesome, but if I still have a lot of work to go, it's going to start getting a little bit alarming as we approach these hours. And so, or as we approach this budget laid out for hours. And so that's important just because, if I'm setting up another project that I can say, this looks a lot like that Lingren home remodel I did in the past. How many hours did we actually spend versus what we set up as the budget? I can look at this and see if it was over budget, then I can budget a little bit higher next time around. If it was under, then budgeting lower as much as, we may end up quoting a lower price and, and making less money on the project. It also may give us a better shot at winning the bid. And so you get more jobs this way. And so it's always a very useful piece of information to know how many hours did we actually spend versus how much we expected to spend on the job. And I also see this really granular reporting of this is how much we're spending for, per each employee and for each phase of the, per each, role of the job. So I get to see here how many foreman hours were submitted, here's how many laborer hours were submitted, and how much we're actually spending versus our budget. That's everything I'm going to be covering with the webinar. I appreciate everyone taking the time today. I'll be getting into the questions submitted in the text chat soon. If you have any questions on this, if you're watching on YouTube, again, shoot us an email. We're support@knowify.com, and we're happy to help. And I want to thank everyone again for attending.